Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of November 17th or thereabouts. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. And we have big political news in Texas this week. News in quotation marks, sort of. Although, look, you have to call it news because...
Wait, did something happen?
Yeah, there's this guy. You may have heard of him.
What?
He was a former congressman who ran for U.S. Senate. His name is Beto O'Rourke.
Oh, he's a cheeky nickname.
And he is now going to run for the Democratic nomination for governor.
Oh, this was the guy who we were talking about and waiting to run for like the last...
Very long time.
Very long. Okay, that
yes.
guy. Yes.
Okay, so we should play it straight.
Okay.
So,
well, yes.
So Beto O'Rourke made his much anticipated announcement that he is in fact running for governor, and I think we joked last week, or maybe it was some other venue about, hey, have you heard Beto? He's going to announce Monday. Well, this Monday he finally announced.
He finally did it.
And so the political news in Texas this week has been dominated more or less by this announcement, and political news in Texas, and after weeks of other kinds of news coming out of Texas, this has been the big national story out of the state more or less this week. So,
yeah,
it's game on. I mean, in retrospect, and we've talked about this on in this venue and others before quite a lot, so there's no point rehashing. I mean, this is not only not super surprising at this point, given that the O'Rourke campaign was sending out signals for the last couple of weeks that this was going to happen.
And it basically cleared the field with whatever indications he was giving in the background, right? So there was that.
Right,
too.
and had given, and was in a position where, I don't want to say he had to, but by waiting as long as he did in terms of clearing the field, as you say, was going to be up for an enormous amount of criticism that I think would have dented his brand pretty seriously had he said, I've just decided this isn't for me in November.
Yeah, nobody has to run for office. In fact, There's probably a lot of people who shouldn't run for office who still do. But yeah,
but in this case,
he would have been heavily blamed for whatever the Democratic outcome was, in sort of the election postmortems down the line, had he not run.
Right. So we've done a post on the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Go to follow the blog link there. And that post rounds up a lot of polling data the way. We've obviously polled quite a bit on Beto O'Rourke when he was running for Senate in 2018. Then when he jumped in the presidential race, a matter of, great attention now, particularly from his opponents in 2020, and then had checked in, I think, here and there. We didn't want to put him in the race before he put himself in the race, although in the October UT Texas Tribune poll, we had to. I mean, really. By then the signals were pretty clear he was going to do it. So we've got a lot of data. So why don't we run through just some of the highlights of that, most of which is in the blog post.
Yeah, let's just hit it real quick. So, we did a hypothetical head-to-head matchup between Abbott and O'Rourke. Again, just if our orientation towards these sorts of things isn't, clear, just caveats. It is super early. There's a campaign to take place. Neither are the nominee for their party yet at this point. So this is just checking in. Where are we? And because of that, we ask it among all registered voters because in our view, there is no such thing is a likely voter electorate at this point. Anyway, in that matchup, Abbott led O'Rourke 46% to 37%. About 7% said, someone else, and about 10% said they hadn't thought about enough to have an opinion. One quick reaction to that might be, the incumbent governor is under 50%. And you say, yeah, but if you take out sort of the people who have no opinion on this race yet, which is kind of crazy, if you pay attention to politics and you're going to turn out, you probably have a view of the governor. you likely have a view of O'Rourke. So if you're someone who's kind of outside this, you might not be that committed to voting if you sort of take them out and reduce the denominator. Abbott's above 50%. Ultimately, it's a 9-point lead. We can talk about that a little bit. We'll just run through some of these other stuff real quick. Abbott led among white Texans 58% to 31%. O'Rourke led among African-American Texans with an opinion 54 to 13, 45 to 33 among Latinos. Abbott led among men, which is very unsurprising in Texas given differences in party identification by gender, 52 to 36. It had a much narrower 42 to 38% lead among women. Among suburbanites, another, which is going to be a big part of where the conflict takes place in the election. A lot of the focus is going to be Abbott led O'Rourke 47% to 36%. This is probably the thing that sort of, I think, is hanging out there the most probably. Only 35% of Texas voters viewed O'Rourke favorably, 20% very favorably, compared to 50% who viewed him unfavorably, with 44% viewing him very unfavorably. Now, obviously, that's being driven by Republicans, right? So 80% of Republicans view him unfavorably. Democratic views are, not surprisingly very favorable, but less intense than Republicans' views. And we see this all the time. I mean, we see this, if we look at Abbott, Democratic views of Abbott are extremely negative and intense. Republican views are positive, but less intensely positive. It's just sort of the nature of these sorts of evaluations. I think something we're going to talk about a lot, and you already kind of hinted at it last week, I assume we're going to do this in the next couple of weeks, is the importance of probably independents in this race. As Texas gets more competitive, I think as both parties are turning towards really, focusing on turnout of their partisans first and foremost in these elections, sort of the way independents break is going to be interesting. And it's important because neither Abbott nor O'Rourke are very well liked among independents at this point. O'Rourke is deeply underwater. Only 22% view him favorably, 48% view him unfavorably. Among Abbott, when we ask about his job approval among independents in the same October poll, 27% approve, 57% disapprove. So net negative 30 compared to O'Rourke's net negative 26. So that's the state of play we find ourselves in right now going into this race.
And I think you look at those numbers and, I think I said something on Twitter last week about, 2022 looking like a very long year. Now I think this is related to something else we're going to talk about a little later on in this podcast, which is the announcement of Ryan Guillen changing parties. But that it was in response to something like that. But when I look at these numbers, what I see is, obviously another mobilization election for Republicans and Democrats. Neither of these candidates are unknown to either their partisans or their opponents or the members of the opposite party. There's already a wellspring of negative impressions for each of those campaigns to reinforce.
Which they're already doing.
In order to channel negative partisanship and to help their own mobilization efforts.
And to raise money.
And then we also have this bit about independence, I think also presages a pretty negative tone to the campaign throughout, given that, it's likely that campaigns will be looking at the negatives among independents who they are going to see as, a relatively narrow band of potentially persuadable potential voters.
Right.
Given independent patterns of turnout, particularly in an off-year election. All of this sort of adds up to a campaign that is already pretty nasty, and to be fair right now, particularly on the Republican side, I'm sure Republicans could say, well, Beto O'Rourke is not being especially nice, but, the early Republican attack ads have been pretty tough. And I don't doubt that there will be, and look, I guess if you're a Republican and you read, I don't know, I assume you read Jonathan Tylov's interview with O'Rourke for Texas Monthly. And, if you're a Republican, you could say, hey, look, Beto O'Rourke is going out and blaming Greg Abbott for the COVID deaths, for the blackout deaths. It's a pretty hard, those are pretty hard punches for complex social phenomenon, one might say.
Yeah. The thing that I think is troubling, you started this by talking about how long a year 2022 is going to be, and we're not even there yet. And that's the thing I think is
already feels long, and we've not completed a calendar day.
Well, and that's the thing. I'd say is it's unfortunate because it's so clearly just systemic in the sense that before O'Rourke got in, and regardless of whether the candidate was O'Rourke or whomever, it was pretty obvious that Abbott was going to paint whoever this person is just basically some socialist who's going to run Texas into the ground in some kind of way. And
in conjunction with Joe Biden.
In conjunction with Joe Biden.
Well-known socialist.
Right, exactly. And Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Green New Deal and blah, and all. And so this is fine. This is fine. I mean, again, we watch this stuff. That's to be expected. It was also clear that O'Rourke was, part of the whole rationale for any Democrat really getting into a race that's going to be in a tough year nationally for Democrats, given Biden's approval numbers, Democrat in the White House, all that stuff, is going to be relying on exactly these issues, right? And we'll get to that in a second. But the response to the pandemic, the failure of the grid, those kinds of things. And so the thing that I think seems so, kind of tough about it is when they're talking about, the contrast between O'Rourke jumping in 2018 versus Cruz right now. And the immediate contrast to today is that he's going out and, whereas before he was introducing himself, he was being, I'm Beto, I'm outside all this. And, that's part of the attraction, right? I think usually for people, and, I'm not attacking Ted Cruz, partially because I don't need to do that, right? Was at least some of the underlying assumption. This time it's clear that's not the playbook. I mean, just from go. And that's why when you think about how this is going to be, it's going to be nasty. It's going to be long. And, I guess I'm looking forward to it because I like to watch these things, but I don't know.
Yeah, I've not ginned up a looking forward to it kind of attitude yet. I guess it'll come. I think that's right. And I think that, there's such an air of inevitability to all of this right now as we're in this transition period. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's dampening my enthusiasm. It's like, yes, of course.
Right.
In the end, Beto O'Rourke got in because who else did the Democrats have? Mm-hmm. As we were saying, I think once he got past a certain point, it was just going to be too damaging. And we should mention, I've been making a deal about the wait, which I think is harmful. And I think that, foregoes a strategy. I think we talked about it last week or the week before that would have been helpful for Democrats overall.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In terms of, Jeff Blaylock in his Texas election news mailing pointed out that, there's only a couple of candidates of the last several Democrats that got in earlier in the gubernatorial race, which is on one hand a fair point, but also might actually make the point that there might have been more benefit to getting in earlier, especially since, as we've discussed on here before, the most successful top of the ticket race that the Democrats have seen was when Beto O'Rourke got in very early against Cruz. And one could say, well, he didn't announce until X date. The moment he and, Will Hurd, switched on their Instagram or whatever it was they were using to stream as they were driving across country,
well, and I think
there was a move going on.
Well, to the Blaylock point, which I agree with, and I agree with the general sort of the missed opportunity piece of this. But I'd also say, Wendy Davis didn't formally announce her campaign until later in the summer, but it was clear to everybody around town and in the space that she was running. I mean, that was.
Yeah,
I recall that being known pretty far before the actual official announcement.
Yeah, honestly, you may be misremembering that just because she was still. And I sort of remember having direct conversations, into the fall. I mean, she didn't really, or into the very late summer. And, there was I would say this, there was much less of an air of inevitability about that. And the timing was, earlier. I'm trying to remember. I guess it was late August when she declared, maybe September.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And I think that it took she gave it a lot of consideration.
Well, sure. Well, anyway, we don't need to let's not rehash that right now. So, I guess the question then becomes, in terms of, I was thinking about this other idea of, are you excited about this or not? It's like, and part of it, I guess, is, the questions that I think I'm getting a lot. And it's sort of the last question that every reporter asks after kind of we run through some of the, where's Beto now? Where's he in the electorate? That kind of piece of it. Some of the stuff that we've gone over is so snowball's chance in hell?
Yeah.
Is kind of the question. I don't know. I sort of my way of answering it. How are you answering that?
Probably to some degree depends on my mood, I think. But my general approach has been, look, this is an uphill battle. He starts as an underdog.
Right.
There's no way around that.
Yeah, that's the truth.
I think the odds are pretty long. And what I would, and this is, I'm saying then this is sort of where I've arrived and kind of what I think, that if the context we're in right now holds, then chances are pretty small.
Right.
Right. And that conversation has, to me, then two routes. The route that a lot of reporters seem to like is, okay, well, then is he done? Or, how close does he have to get for his career to not be done? And we can put a pin in that whole, preoccupation with Beto O'Rourke's political path among reporters. Fair enough topic, but
it's funny. I get that too. I've gotten that too.
It's not.
So he loses again. His career's over. I'm kind of like, well,
no,
why?
Maybe I don't think so. Yeah, but then the other piece of that I think is more important is, of course, the structural conditions. I mean, if things hold as they are now, if the inflation numbers stay on the same trajectory, if the economy continues to sort of chug along at the pace it's at, if the political dynamic nationally stays more or less the same, but most critically, if there's no, fundamental external shock or crisis on the ground in Texas, it's pretty hard to see Greg Abbott's substantial advantages here not carry the day.
Right.
And again, something we're beating a dead horse on this on the podcast, but but if something goes wrong and that, and I would say that something really is the power grid.
Right.
Or, something we should have very much internalized, since the day that, Donald Trump was inaugurated. Mm-hmm. Things can take a turn that you really don't anticipate.
Right.
It's and a big one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of big structural things you've got there. We're in a very dynamic environment. And so, that puts, if you're a Democrat, it puts you in, the kind of unfortunate position of sitting around and waiting for a disaster to happen to shake up the race for you. Or I suppose, in the more mundane sense of things, some fundamental mistake by Greg Abbott. I can't really even quite imagine what that would be. Now, that's consistent with what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it's a testament to Abbott's advantage that and both the nature of the environment right now, in which things that people often might think of as gaffes that people should get a lot of grief over. It's not as if Governor Abbott doesn't say things that are kind of sometimes outside the bounds. I mean, maybe as another foreshadowing hint, I mean, he congratulated Ryan Guillen the other day when he became a Republican for coming out of, when he switched parties, for coming out of the closet.
Yeah,
now, and it seems to have gotten kind of made fun of for it a little bit on Twitter or whatever, but it wasn't.
It's very hard in the current political climate to imagine what
a gaffe that transcends partisanship.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, because most of the time the thing that we think of as a gaffe is going to come out in a way that, in most cases, like your partisans are going to kind of agree with, if right. At worst case tacitly.
Yeah, and in most cases, or give you such an enormous wellspring of the benefit of the doubt, as long as it's not too much of a mistake, that violates the activist wing of your party. But even that is, because of the balance of the numerical balance, and we're in a campaign environment. I mean, look, we're seeing the stray too far, but we're seeing an example of this at the national level right now with this congressman, Paul Gosar, in his video that his staff produced of them.
His face on some
like
anime
murdering AOC or something. I mean, I never did see the video, but it's now and they're voting to send to punish him in the Congress today, and the Democrats will have the majority, and they'll impose some kind of penalty. And all indications are all but the most apostate Republicans in Congress, and like two of them will vote against it.
Right, and if anything, he'll probably raise money off of it.
Right, and I guess that's my snowball's chance answer is, I borderline admonish reporters to say, like, a year out, we shouldn't necessarily be deciding the election. There's a lot of things that could happen, But it's also kind of borderline idiotic to not recognize the substantial advantages that Greg Abbott has in this race and where the Republicans are in the state. I wanted to move up, and you know what? I'm going to keep going because I pasted the wrong numbers in these notes anyway. So I just noticed. But, I mean, I guess I would notice that, I am curious what you think about you kind of mentioned this obliquely a minute ago or without much detail a minute ago. The initial positioning of O'Rourke in his first wave of interviews, I think has been interesting. He's been doing the things that we're talking about, saying that, this can't, and it's, for somebody, we think, you mentioned earlier, Beto O'Rourke's earlier kind of image as kind of unorthodox and, all the F-bombs of 2018.
Borden and Whataburger Park.
Right, all that kind of stuff. And,
standing on tables.
But, in the early interviews, there's definitely much more, a clear messaging and clear pivots away from anticipated critical questions. So, again, our friend, we're in the tank. Our friend Jonathan Tylov asked a lot of very direct questions of him. Mm-hmm. And he did a good job of, I think to paraphrase one of Jonathan's questions was something like, what do you expect to be viewed as more authentically Texans, saying you'll ban AK-47s or supporting unconcealed carry? And O'Rourke kind of said, well, that's not, look, I'm still in favor of that, and pivoted pretty well to saying, but that's not really about that. It's not about me or that anyway. Well, it's not about my 2020 race. It's about Greg Abbott and how he's governed. And he launched into the, 700 people died during the, during the blackouts, the COVID death count. So we see that. And I think that's, that's interesting. And then a day later, the thing that got the most attention, I think, or has gotten a little bit more attention in the last 24 hours, I think either later on the first day, maybe late yesterday, I'm not sure exactly when this happened, he did an interview with a CBS affiliate, I think. And sort of dinged Joe Biden, the Biden administration, for not doing enough on immigration.
A little something.
Yeah, I think people made a little bit more. It's not like he said, I'm renouncing Joe Biden and all his evil works.
Just a little elbow. A
little elbow for distance, Yeah. I'm dribbling. You're kind of on my back, Well,
I think, when listening to you say this, the thing that strikes me, if you kind of put all that together is you think, if you're O'Rourke, I think right now you're sitting there saying, I want this to be a referendum on Abbott. He's been in office.
Right.
Abbott wants to paint me as this other thing. And he's saying, hey, don't listen.
Right.
He's trying to say that I'm all these things, and that's fine. But, we can just look and say, well, how many Texans have died from COVID?
I think the default political term here is that's a distraction, sir.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Texans will not be distracted. But I did think that, the Biden border security thing was interesting. Based on our poll numbers that show that, Biden's numbers on border security, including among Democrats, are, bad and still sinking.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things where O'Rourke is probably going to try to play a little bit to some of his strengths here, which is the whole, the El Paso background, the whole, binational city, this whole thing. And, I think the idea that he could probably bring is, hey, I can authentically deal with this as a Democrat would be what I'd imagine he would try to say.
Yeah, I wonder how he'd answer the question. We need to sort of see if we can't maybe ask him ourselves somehow. But would you spend this much money on border security? If not, why not? And if so, how would you spend it differently than Greg Abbott?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
That's a challenge.
But I think there are potentially opportunities for him there, particularly, perhaps among independents, but we'll have to see. So let's switch gears for the last few minutes. So, there was also big news. It's kind of, and some of this was pretty clearly counter-programming by the Republicans.
Right.
And that, as, proximate to the time that Beto O'Rourke was announcing that he was going to run for governor, there was an event at the Capitol with the House leadership and Governor Abbott, in which a longtime member of the legislature, Ryan Guillen, announced that he was switching parties. And, that got, as counter-programming goes, Ryan Guillen was not going to outweigh Beto O'Rourke with reporters, but, he did pretty well.
Yeah, he did a pretty good job.
He did a pretty good job. They made that work. And
well, it fits the frame, right? It was why it's good. It was good programming on Republicans' part, but it's good programming because it was, you can't avoid it if you're any reporter who's been covering Texas politics and you've been talking about, the potential inroads that Republicans have made in South Texas among Hispanics. This is just a story that fits in that frame so well.
Right.
I mean, the question sort of, and maybe this is this is almost a question for another podcast, the beginning of a broader question, which is, sort of, how much do you buy that story?
Yeah.
Because, that's sort of, where I am a little bit on it, is that it's, it's attractive because it's sort of, it's counter attitude, people don't expect it. But it also, I would say, not to get too far down this road, but like we've talked a lot about how people's expectations about the Hispanic electorate and the realities of the Hispanic electorate are pretty different. And especially people kind of looking in from the outside. And so, so that's one contextual piece that I think we might have to save for another week. Another will also point out, South Texas, not a huge population center in the state. Some parts of it for sure, but not,
Yeah, my favorite, sort of reminder of that is how, after the 2020 election, people were just going, reporters who are people, but not all people, but there was, a big, the example that was in all of these stories was Zapata County.
Right.
Right, Zapata County went Republican for the first time we went down there and we talked to people and we're talking about well less than 100,000 voters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well less.
Well less. And I don't have the exact number in front of me, so I don't want to put out the wrong number, but I believe it's in the tens. Right. And so that's just not, and I think you're right. And we've said this on here, there's a kind of an imaginary baseline of Latino support for Republicans, which in the imagination of reporters and outside observers is much lower than it actually is in actuality.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So you look at this and you say, like, well, there's a redistricting process, and now Representative Guillen is in a much more Republican district. And he was already in a district that I think voted for Trump beforehand, and he still won. He's now in a more Republican district.
Right. The district he's in now is a Trump 25. The redrawn district would be a Trump 25 district.
Right. And so, one of the things that I always wonder about this, and this is like an existential question, maybe we're getting near the end here, but it's like, how often does it work to manifest something like this? You know what I mean? So, like, the idea
it depends. There's a bunch of different things going on here. It's a cycle right after redistricting when this is most likely to happen. And there've been rumors this is going on. Ryan Guillen, if you look at Mark Jones' ideological rankings, is the most conservative, or the least liberal.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mark, the least liberal,
right?
Democratic, House member, et cetera. So, there's not, and in all the, the talk around town about who might switch, he was the number one candidate all along.
Right.
Right. And, it will be interesting, not that, we think of things wholly transactionally, but it will be interesting to see what he gets out of this.
Yes, it will be.
Say. The other big news, in TextLedge and, at the intersection of #TextLedge and #Texas 2020, which maybe I just didn't have my ear to the ground, but was something of a surprise to me, is that House member Michelle Beckley has joined the race for the nomination to be the Democrats' candidate for lieutenant governor in 2020. So she joins Mike Collier, who's run twice and was already, had an irritant, shall we say, with the entrance of Matthew Dowd, political commentator and former political consultant and communications consultant. I think this was greeted with some degree of surprise.
Yeah.
In a lot of corners. Now, again, redistricting dynamic.
Yeah.
She had been treated fairly roughly in the redistricting process and was a little bit without a home and had considered, running for a congressional district in her North Texas, and that was a close district she was in anyway. She was already in for a fight. She was going to run for a congressional seat. That congressional seat got redrawn. That left her outside of the border of the district. And so now she's going to throw her hat in for lieutenant governor. She becomes, an interesting dynamic in that race if she stays in and, exerts any presence in that, she will be pretty substantially, near as I can tell, to the left of both of the present candidates.
And not an older white man.
And not an older white guy.
But it's interesting because on the one hand, you'd say, we just did this polling before she announced, we asked fave, unfave items on Collier and Dowd. And kind of the main takeaway from that I think is worth knowing is just that, most Democrats don't know who these people are.
Right.
And this is even for Collier, who's run twice, 70% of potential Democratic primary voters don't have an opinion of him.
Right.
And so you have to assume that Beckley starts even further unknown than he does. But in some ways,
frankly, not.
that might be her advantage. I mean, in some way, what you're laying out here actually is the fact that, a couple, choice endorsements from some left-leaning groups, the fact that, she's not a white man, which, in the Democratic primary would probably help her out. As we talk about it, the case kind of presents itself, although it still is a little.
And for anybody of a certain generation, we'll just say, all of a sudden, people start thinking about a Sissy Farenthold scenario. Now, that didn't turn out well for the Democrats, but nonetheless, it was an interesting development. And we should also note, in terms of the things that we tend to pay attention to a lot, there's going to be a lot of turnover in the House. We haven't had any primary elections or any general election, which allows for candidates to actually lose.
Right, at least in the primary this time.
Right, and we've got 22 House vacancies and 4 Senate vacancies right now.
Feels like a lot.
It's a lot. It feels like a lot, particularly in the Senate, because it is.
Yeah.
And so I think this is something to really keep an eye on because, of course, the top of the ticket races, these are all, they matter a lot. But those 22 House seats, those 22 exits from the House also mean, 22 open races.
Yes.
Both in the primary and the general election. What it portends is, as we were talking about 2022 being a very long election year from my perspective, it means in all likelihood that election night 2022 is going to be a late one and is going to be very exciting with a lot of turnover and a lot to track between now and then.
Yeah, that's right.
So with that, I'll thank Josh for being here. Thank our excellent crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas. We've referenced, as always, a bunch of data today and a blog post besides. You'll find all that at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. We'll be out next week for Thanksgiving, but probably back for at least a podcast or two before the year is out. So enjoy the rest of the week. Have a good holiday, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.